There are nights in life when you lie down, look up at the ceiling, and ask yourself a question you never say out loud. Why do I work so hard, yet life doesn't seem to get much better? Why does money come and go as fast as the wind? Why does every month feel the same, only different in the level of worry? I've been there. In my younger years, I worked tirelessly, running across states, selling products, hoping that effort would save me. But then one day, when I opened my wallet and looked at the empty space inside, I realized the problem wasn't the job, wasn't the economy, wasn't luck. The problem was me, because no one had ever taught me how to think about money. No one told me that finance doesn't begin with the number in your account, it begins with the philosophy in your mind. No one told me that a single dollar could be the starting point of freedom if used the right way. And that's why this video matters. Because there are things, if you knew them earlier, you wouldn't have lived so depleted. In the next few minutes, I'll share with you the principles I wish I had known when I was poor, confused, and convinced I was stuck. Stay until the end, because the final part of this video might change the way you look at yourself and at the little dollar you're holding in your hand. And then, I realized a truth that opened an entirely new journey. Principle 1, change your philosophy about money before you change your income. There was a long period in my life when I believed that if I just worked harder, just put in a few more hours each day, just pushed a little more, everything would eventually change. I thought income was the direct result of effort. But then one winter afternoon, I came home from a long trip, opened my wallet, and looked at the empty space inside, and that moment stunned me. Not because I had no money, but because I realized I had no direction. I was working, but I wasn't moving forward. I was trying, but I was only spinning in circles. And I understood that something deeper was missing in my life. The next day, I met my first mentor, Mr. Schoaf. He looked at me for a long moment, then asked a simple question. Jim, why are you letting yourself live like this? I was about to answer, but I couldn't, because any words I said would only be excuses. And that's when he told me, it's not the world holding you back, it's your philosophy holding you back. I had never thought about money that way. I only saw money as something I earned. But he said money is something you attract. And I understood this was the beginning of a new journey. Because philosophy is like the captain steering a ship. If the direction is wrong, no matter how hard you row, the ship will never reach the shore. It's not the strength that determines the destination, it's the direction. And in finance, it's the same. It's not income that determines freedom, it's your mindset about money. I used to believe financial freedom came from a better salary, better job, better opportunities. But then I realized there are people who earn a lot but still worry, still lack, still live in fear of running out. And there are people who earn very little but live with peace because they know how to think about money and how to make money serve their life. One of the moments that changed me was when Schoaf said, Jim, if you give $1 million to someone with a poor financial philosophy, all you have to do is wait and you'll get back the same poor person you started with. I had seen that in real life, lottery winners losing everything, heirs ending up broke, people increasing their income yet falling deeper into debt than before. And I understood that money does not solve financial problems, philosophy does. Imagine a vast field. If a farmer sows the wrong seeds, even fertile soil is useless. If the seeds are weak, even springtime can't save them. Philosophy is the seed, income is only the soil. When philosophy is right, money flourishes. When philosophy is wrong, money withers. And that's why, before the first dollar is ever managed, before any 70-10-10 formula is applied, before we talk about giving or investing, we must start from within. I want to ask you a question you don't have to answer out loud. Are you working for money, or is your philosophy making money work for you? Because two completely different lives begin from that answer. It's not money that holds you back, it's your mindset about money. When I changed my philosophy, everything else began to change, slowly but surely. And then I realized that philosophy doesn't come from luck, nor from desire. It comes from the choice to learn every day. No one is born with the right philosophy. We form it from what we hear, see, and believe. And just as a ship changes direction with a small turn of the wheel, a financial life changes direction with a small shift in thinking. And then I learned the next thing, the thing that brought me to the first step of financial freedom. Principle 2, start with $1 because size doesn't matter, the habit does. After my first conversation with Schoaf, I went home with a strange feeling. Not excitement, not worry, but a quietness that made me reflect. I looked around the small room I lived in at the time, the simple desk, a few old books, a coat hanging by the door, and on the table were a few leftover coins from the trip. I picked up $1 and realized that for years I had never truly thought about that little bill. I only saw it as something to spend, to trade for something else, to get through the day. But I had never seen it as the beginning of a different future. And that was the moment I understood that financial freedom doesn't begin when you have a lot, it begins when you know what to do with a little. The next day, I went back to see Shof. I told him I would manage my finances when I had more money. He smiled, shook his head slowly, and said a sentence I remember for life. Jim, if you can't manage $1, you'll lose 1,000 the exact same way. I stayed silent because I knew he was right. It's not the amount that determines your ability to manage, it's the habit. It's not a big number that creates discipline. Discipline creates the big number. And I understood that $1 isn't small, it's the first test. I've met many people in life, people who are waiting for a better job before they save, waiting for their income to rise before they learn to manage, waiting for things to get easier before they change. But they don't realize that waiting is how life stays still. And time always wins against the person who stands still. Because habits don't grow tomorrow, they grow today, right in this moment, starting with the first $1. Imagine a drop of water falling on a rock. One drop does nothing. But thousands, tens of thousands of drops can carve through the hardest stone. Not because of the power of each drop, but because of repetition. $1 is like that drop. Small, but if treated right, it can become a stream, then a river, then a current that carries you to a different life. Not because of its value, but because of the value of the habit it builds. I want you to pause for a moment and ask yourself, have you ever dismissed $1, then dismissed 10, then dismissed an entire month of income disappearing without knowing where it went? Because many people aren't poor because they lack money. They're poor because they lack awareness of money. $1 can teach you what $1,000 cannot: discipline, awareness, respect for your own financial journey. And when you respect $1, life gives you more to manage. If you don't manage $1, you'll lose 1,000. When I began managing $1, I changed. Not because the world changed, but because I did. I rewrote the way I spent, the way I kept, the way I looked at value. And then, like a farmer planting the first seed into the ground, spring began in my soul before it ever appeared in the field of my wallet. Not because I became wealthy immediately, but because I knew I was finally moving in the right direction. And that is the starting point of every journey to freedom. And then I learned the next thing, the thing most people overlook their entire lives. Principle 3, live below what you earn, the 70% rule. There was a period in my life when I worked harder than anyone I knew. I left home early, returned late, carrying the hope that if I worked more, I'd have more. But at the end of each month, when I looked at what was left, it was always a tiny number, sometimes even a negative one. I asked myself, how could that be? I was working more, trying harder, pushing further, yet my life wasn't changing. And then I realized it wasn't income that determined my life, it was how I spent it. When I told this to Shof, he just smiled gently, as if he had heard this story hundreds of times. He said, Jim, the problem isn't how much you earn. The problem is how much you keep. I had never thought of it that way. I believed the solution was to earn more. But he said many people earn more, yet still live in anxiety because they increase their lifestyle faster than they increase their income. And I began to realize that freedom doesn't come from money, it comes from the ratio between income and spending. That's when he taught me the first rule of financial freedom: never spend more than 70% of what you earn. At first, I thought it was impossible. I had bills, expenses, needs, and small desires I believed I deserved. But then Shof said, Jim, if you don't learn to shrink your spending, you'll never learn to expand your life. And he told me about people with good incomes who still lived under pressure because they always chased a lifestyle they couldn't truly sustain. I realized many people aren't poor because they lack money, they're poor because they lack limits. And limits are the beginning of freedom. Imagine a water tank with a hole at the bottom. No matter how much you pour in, the water keeps leaking out. And the faster you pour, the faster it drains. Income is the water. Uncontrolled spending is the hole. And the 70% rule is how you patch the leak. When I began applying it, I saw myself change. I learned to say no to things I didn't need. I began distinguishing between desire and value. I started living more simply, not because I forced myself to, but because I began respecting my future more than my short-term impulses. I want you to stop and ask yourself, Have you ever increased your income, yet your life stayed exactly the same, only the bills got bigger? Because many people aren't trapped by poverty, they're trapped by consumption habits. And when they spend too much, they lose the most important thing, the ability to accumulate, to invest, to change their future. The 70% rule isn't a restriction, it's the door to the rest of the journey. Because only when you spend less than you earn do you have something left to give, to invest, to plant. One thing that changed me was when I realized freedom doesn't come from having more, it comes from needing less. When you live below your means, you have room to breathe. When you spend less, you're no longer driven by fear of running out. When you keep your portion, you can build. And like a farmer who keeps seeds instead of eating them, it's the part you keep that creates the next season. The rich are not the ones who earn more, they are the ones who keep more. From the day I applied the 70% rule, I felt my life shift. Not because I became wealthy immediately, but because I felt in control. And that's a feeling money can't buy. I began saving with intention. I began tracking my cash flow. I began understanding where every dollar went and why. And like a ship that lightens its load to rise on the water, I felt lighter, clearer, calmer. Not because the world changed, but because the way I lived in the world changed. And then I learned one more thing, something that took my financial life from surviving to growing. Principle 4, 10%, to give sow seeds to reap a harvest. When I began living below my income, I felt life gradually becoming lighter. But there was still something in my mind that made me wonder, why did my mentor tell me that I had to set aside a portion of my income to give? In the years when I was still struggling, the thought of sharing even a small part of the little money I had seemed impossible. I thought giving was a privilege of the rich. But then one day, in a long conversation, Shof looked me in the eyes and said, Jim, giving is not the act of someone who has a lot, it is the act of someone who is becoming more. I still clearly remember a memory from long ago, when I was a young man who didn't yet know where he was going. I had only a few coins in my pocket, and I hesitated for a long time before deciding to put a small part into the donation box at church. I didn't think it was anything big, but when I walked out of that door, I felt something inside me change, not because of the amount I put in, but because I realized I had not let fear control me. And that was the first time I understood that giving did not make me poorer, it made me more open. Because giving is not just a financial act, it is an act of the soul. It reminds us that we don't live just for ourselves. It opens the flow instead of closing it. It makes us become more fertile soil to receive. I have seen this in the lives of many people. Those who have the habit of giving always have something abundant in their hearts, in their relationships, in the way they walk through this life. They are not just rich in money, they are rich in value. And just as the farmer understands the law of seasons, we must learn to sow before we expect a harvest. No one stands in front of an empty field and demands a crop of corn. They plant seeds, they tend the soil, they trust time. Then spring comes. Giving is the same, it is a seed sown into life. And the seed is always small, but the result is always many times greater than it. It is no coincidence that those who understand this law often have lives more expansive than others. I want you to pause and ask yourself a question you don't need to say out loud. Have you ever given not because you had plenty, but because you wanted to become a person who is able to give? Because there is a very big difference between those two things. One person gives because they have much, but another person gives because they choose to become someone with that capacity. And it is that choice that creates deep change. You are not poor when you give. You are poor when you keep everything for yourself. When I began setting aside 10% to give, I didn't become rich overnight, but I changed. I began to feel that I was no longer living in a state of lack. I began to look at life with more grateful eyes. I began to understand that finance is not only about receiving, but also about giving. Not only about accumulation, but about flow. And just as still water becomes stagnant, moving water becomes clear, so it is with money. And then I realized the next thing. Because after you know how to keep and know how to give, you must learn what my mentor called the first turning point in the journey to financial freedom. Creating value to generate profit, starting from the small part that remains in your hands. Principle 5, 10% active capital investment. Create value before receiving value. When I began setting aside 10% to give, I felt myself changing in ways I hadn't expected. But then my mentor said there was a next step, a step he called the first turning point in the journey to financial freedom. He said, Jim, giving makes your heart open, but investing is what opens your future. I had never thought I could become an investor. I only saw myself as a worker, someone who earned money with his time and effort. But Shof said, if you only work to earn money, you will always be limited by the number of hours in a day. But if you invest, you create something that can work for you. I still remember the first time he explained active capital to me. He said, Jim, active capital is the portion you use to create value in the marketplace. It can be a small product, a service, a skill, an idea, and when value is created, money will find its way there. I looked into my pocket and saw only a few small bills. I thought, how can someone like me invest? But he said, it doesn't matter how much you have. What matters is that you learn to use a small part to create something bigger. There was a time when I met a boy selling soap. He bought a bar of soap for $2, then sold it for $3 to his neighbors. $1 small of profit. But his eyes lit up as if he had just discovered the secret of life. And then he did something that many adults don't do. He used those $3 to buy more instead of spending it all. And I realized that active capital investment can begin earlier than we think, smaller than we think, simpler than we think. Not a big company, not a grand project, just a simple act of creating value. Imagine a farmer standing in front of his field. He wants a harvest, but he knows desire doesn't create kernels of corn. He has to sow. He has to put the seeds into the soil. He has to accept waiting, and he has to believe that those small seeds will produce more than themselves. Active capital investment is the same. It is the seed. And like the farmer, if we eat the seed, we lose the next season. I want you to pause and ask yourself, have you ever wanted a harvest without sowing? Have you ever wanted to change your finances without creating new value in the marketplace? Because many people want more but don't become someone who can create more, and that is why they remain in place. Not because they lack opportunity, but because they lack the habit of using a portion of their income to sow. Money doesn't come because you need it. Money comes because you create value. When I began setting aside 10% for active capital, I didn't know where it would lead me, but I knew I had started. I used that portion to learn new skills, to print a flyer, to test a small idea, to step into the marketplace. And then I realized what my mentor once said, the marketplace always pays fairly to those who create value. Not immediately, not easily, but surely. And just like the farmer, after the sowing season comes the sprouting season. After the sprouting season comes the growing season. And after the growing season comes the harvest. But that journey only begins when the seed is placed in the ground. And active capital is that seed, small but decisive. And then I understood one more thing, something my mentor called the second leap. When value works for you, even when you're not working, when money makes money. Principle 6, 10% passive capital investment. Let money work when you're not working. After I began using 10% to invest active capital and create value in the marketplace, I felt I had entered a new phase in my financial journey. But then one day, Shof said something that made me pause for a long time. Jim, there is something even more important than you making money. It's letting money make money. I looked at him, not yet fully grasping the depth of that statement. He continued, because if your life depends only on your labor, then when your strength stops, your income stops. And that was the moment I first thought about freedom in a different sense, freedom not just as earning money, but as having cash flow even when you stop. I used to believe that income had to come from work. I thought that to have more, I had to do more. But then I realized there are people who still have income even when they no longer work. They have equity, they have returns, they have small assets that generate a steady cash flow. I thought about that for a long time, because for many early years of my life, I lived with the belief that finances were a reward for effort. But the deeper truth is, sustainable finances are a reward for building, and passive capital is the first foundation of that sustainability. I still remember the first time Shof showed me the difference. He said, Jim, when you work, you have income. But when you own something that creates income, you have freedom. That sentence made me think for many days. I looked back at my life and realized I had always been trading time for money. And if one day I got sick, or got tired, or stopped, then everything would disappear. And that was the moment I understood that passive capital is not the privilege of the rich, it is the transition of someone who is learning to become free. Imagine a flywheel. At first, it takes a lot of force to get it moving. But once it's turning, it keeps moving thanks to its own momentum. Earned income is like you pushing the wheel with your hands, turn by turn. But passive income is like the wheel spinning thanks to the energy already stored. It keeps going even when you let go. That is the difference between surviving and freedom. I want you to pause and ask yourself slowly, seriously, what would happen to your life if for 1 month you couldn't work? What about a year? Because the answer to that question will reveal where you are in your financial journey. If your income depends entirely on you, you are not free yet. If you have cash flow, even when you stop, you are stepping into a different kind of life. Labor helps you live. Cash flow helps you become free. When I began setting aside 10% for passive capital, I didn't invest in anything fancy. I started with small amounts, simple returns, modest but steady assets. And I realized passive capital is not about getting rich quickly, it's about building slowly. It's like planting a long-lived tree. In the first years, nothing seems to change. But over time, the shade appears, then the fruit appears, and then you realize you no longer have to plant again. That tree keeps producing year after year. I've seen this in many people. Those who build passive capital have a peace that those who only rely on labor don't have, because they don't live in fear of tomorrow. They don't live in anxiety about the unexpected. They have a foundation. They have support. They have breathing room in life, and that breathing room makes them deeper in the way they work, live, and give. And then I understood something else. Because after you know how to keep, how to give, how to sow value, and how to create cash flow, the next thing will determine the speed of your growth. The environment you live in. Principle 7. The environment determines your income level. After I began having small streams of income from passive capital, I felt my life lift to a new level. But then one quiet afternoon as I was sitting with my mentor, he said something that made me think for a long time. Jim, you cannot grow into greatness in a small environment. I looked at him, not yet grasping the full meaning of that. He continued, because the environment is the invisible limit that people rarely notice. It doesn't bind you with rope, but with habits, with thinking, with what everyone around you accepts as normal, having minds. I remembered the early years of my life when I lived among people who always talked about lack, about what was impossible, about how life could only be this way. I didn't realize that those statements, repeated every day, were making me shrink. I lived within the frame others had drawn. I dreamed just enough not to be laughed at. I tried just enough not to be reminded. And then one day, I understood that it wasn't that I lacked ability, I lacked space for my ability to grow. My mentor told me about a bonsai tree. It is not a naturally small species. It is a large tree, one that can grow tall, cast shade, and become a giant. But it is planted in a small pot. Its roots are limited. Its space is limited. And then it too becomes small, not because of its nature, but because of its environment. He looked at me and said, Jim, people are the same way. I stayed silent for a long time because I realized that I had once lived like that bonsai, made small by words, by beliefs, by people who couldn't see what I could become. I want you to pause and ask yourself gently, but honestly, are you living in an environment that expands you or shrinks you? Are you with people who remind you to rise, or with those who make you stop? Because income is not only the result of ability, it is the result of environment. A person may have talent, but if he lives among those who don't believe in growth, he will eventually live like them. And conversely, an ordinary person who lives among those who believe in ability, in value, in the future, he will grow along with them. I have seen this many times in my life. At the seminars I attended, I saw ordinary people step into a new environment where they were encouraged, inspired, surrounded by expansive thinking. And after a time, they changed. Not because someone told them what to do, but because the new air made them breathe deeper. The new light made them see farther. And the presence of great people made them grow to match. If you stay in a small place, you will have to shrink yourself to fit. When I began changing my environment, my life changed. I started spending time with people who talked about opportunities, not limits. I began listening to stories of growth, not resignation. I started being around people who made me ask new questions, bigger questions about myself, my abilities, my future. And then I realized something. Environment doesn't just affect income, it shapes the person we are becoming. And just like changing the soil for a tree, changing the space for its roots, the transformation doesn't happen in a day, but it happens surely. The tree begins to grow taller. The leaves start to become greener. And eventually, it returns to its true size. People are the same. When in the right environment, we don't have to force ourselves to grow, we grow naturally. And then I understood that after you have the right environment, the next thing will determine your ability to reach your destination. The small habits you repeat every day. Principle 8. Micro-disciplines, small habits create big results. After I changed my environment and began living among people with a more expansive mindset, I felt myself growing in a very natural way. But then one day, while talking with my mentor, he said something that made me think for a long time. Jim, the environment helps you grow, but discipline turns you into the person you want to become. I looked at him, and he continued, because no one matures just from inspiration. People mature from habits repeated every day. I remembered the years I tried to change my life with big efforts, big plans, big promises, but then everything went back to the way it was. I once wrote down ambitious goals, then set them aside. I once told myself I would start next week, next month, when circumstances were better, but nothing changed. And I understood that the reason wasn't that the goals were too big, it was that my habits were too small to carry them. I had lived a life of intentions, but not of small actions. One afternoon, Shoaff said to me, Jim, if you can't do the small thing consistently, you will never fully do the big thing. He told me to record my daily spending, just a few lines, just a few minutes. At first, I thought it was unnecessary. But then I realized that the act of recording itself made me aware. It let me see the dollars disappearing without a trace. It made me realize I was spending based on emotion, not choice. And from those few minutes of daily recording, I began to have a clarity I had never had before. Imagine a magnificent castle. It isn't built from gigantic stones, but from many small bricks laid on top of each other, day after day. No one sees the beauty in the first brick, but it is that brick that makes the entire structure possible. Micro-discipline is the same. It is the brick. It's small, simple, unimpressive. But if repeated, it can support an entire life. And without it, any goal, no matter how beautiful, collapses. I want you to ask yourself slowly and sincerely, have you ever wanted big change, but ignored small actions? Have you ever waited for inspiration to start, instead of starting so inspiration would come? Because many people don't fail from a lack of opportunity, but from a lack of small habits that nourish their abilities each day. And it is those small habits that determine resilience, stability, and growth. Small discipline is cheaper than big regret. When I began repeating small actions, my life changed slowly but surely. I tracked where every dollar went. I reminded myself to read a few pages every day. I practiced skills bit by bit. I spent time reflecting instead of just reacting. And like the sun rising every morning, those changes happened quietly, but undeniably. I have seen this in many people I've met along my journey. Successful people are not those who are always motivated. They are those who do the right thing even when they are not motivated. They don't chase explosive moments. They build on small steps. They don't rely on feelings. They rely on choices. And repeated choices form character. Character shapes destiny. And just like the farmer who waters his plants every day, not because the tree will bear fruit today, but because when the season comes, it will micro-discipline is the quiet nurturing of life. It doesn't demand perfection. It only demands continuity. And then, I understood that after you have the right small habits, the next thing will determine how far you can go in this life. Emotional endurance, the ability to keep going even when it's slow, when you're tired, when you haven't yet seen results. Principle 9, emotional endurance, keep going even when it's slow, small, and you don't yet see results. After I began building small daily habits, I realized that although those habits were simple, the journey of maintaining them was not as easy as I had imagined. There were mornings when I felt full of determination, but there were also days I woke up heavy-hearted, wondering whether these little things I was doing would actually lead to anything. In those moments, I remembered what my mentor once said. Jim, what separates those who get what they want from those who only dream about it is not talent, but emotional endurance. I once believed that success came from intelligence, luck, or opportunity. But then I met people who were very smart but quit too soon. People who had opportunities but were afraid. People who were close to the finish line but turned back because they ran out of patience. And I understood that finances, like life, do not reward the start, they reward the ability to continue. Because there are times when you plant seeds and don't yet see sprouts. Times when you water the tree and don't yet see leaves. Times when you make efforts and don't yet see results. And it is precisely those silent stretches that will test the strength of your soul. I still remember a phase in my life when I was doing what my mentor taught, saving consciously, giving, investing, active capital, building passive cash flow, living in a positive environment, and maintaining small daily disciplines. Yet there were still moments when I looked at my finances and asked myself, why is everything changing so slowly? I felt like I was walking in fog, knowing I was moving, but unable to clearly see the path. And then Shove said something to me that was gentle but profound. Jim, winter doesn't last forever, but those who quit stay where they are forever. Imagine a field in winter. The ground is cold, the trees are bare, and no one can see the life beneath that hard layer of soil. But the farmer still believes. He still prepares his tools. He still tends the land. He still holds on to the belief that spring will come. Emotional endurance is the same. It is the ability to continue even when no one sees, even when no one praises, even when the results haven't come. It is the gentle reminder that what we sow today will grow as long as we don't stop. I want you to ask yourself a question deeply and honestly. How many times have you been very close to change, but turned back because you were too tired? How many times were you moving forward, but gave up because you didn't see results immediately? Because many people don't fail because they can't. They fail because they stop too soon. They let temporary emotions ruin a long-term future. They let doubt overshadow ability. And then they convince themselves they are not meant for success, when the truth is they were only missing a little more persistence. Winter doesn't last forever, but those who quit stay where they are forever. When I began to understand that, I changed the way I looked at my financial journey. I no longer expected results to come quickly. I no longer demanded that life prove something to me right away. I became more patient with myself. I became gentler with the process. And then, like the sun appearing after long overcast days, the changes gradually became clear, not in a single explosive moment, but in quiet accumulation. I've seen emotional endurance in the people I've met, the father who takes on a second job, yet still spends time reading one chapter every night, the mother who saves every small amount to buy her children a better future, the young person who repeats small steps even when no one around him believes. They're not loud, they don't boast, but they have a strength. Not everyone has the strength to keep going. And just like a river that wears down rock, not through force, but through repetition, emotional endurance can open paths that intermittent bursts of effort never could. It doesn't create miracles, it creates results. It doesn't create noise, it creates change. And one day, others will call them lucky. But they know it wasn't luck, it was not giving up. And then, I understood that after emotional endurance, the final part of the journey is no longer about money, but about meaning. About seeing financial freedom as a journey, not a destination. Principle 10. Financial freedom is a journey, not a destination. After I learned emotional endurance and realized that big changes are born from quiet persistence, I began to look at my financial life from a different perspective. But then one evening, as I was sitting alone in a quiet room, I realized that for a long time, I had still been holding on to a deep misunderstanding. I thought financial freedom was a destination, a place where once I stepped into it, all worries would disappear, all insecurity would fade, and life would become completely fulfilled. But then, in that stillness, I understood that financial freedom is not a finish line to be reached, it is a journey to be lived. My mentor once said, Jim, you will never have financial freedom in a single day. You will have financial freedom each day, one step at a time. I used to think that freedom came when I hit a certain number in my bank account. But then I met people who had reached that number and still felt anxious, still feared losing it, still felt it was not enough. And I realized that if the mind is not free, no amount of money can erase the worry inside. I still remember the early years when I had very little in my hands, but every time I wrote down my goals, every time I managed a single dollar, every time I lived more consciously, I felt a small part of me become freer. Not because the number increased, but because I knew I was moving forward. And that feeling, the feeling of moving in the right direction, is the real freedom. Imagine a long staircase leading to a high summit. Each step is a small move. You cannot jump from the ground straight to the top in a single moment. But if you take one more step, then another, you are already higher than you once were, and at each landing, you can see farther, wider, and clearer. Financial freedom is the same. It's not a leap. It's a walk. Not an ending point, but an unfolding. I want you to pause and ask yourself slowly and deeply. Are you living as if freedom only comes when you achieve something big? Or are you realizing that freedom can begin with the small action you take today? Because many people postpone their lives for some moment in the future when they imagine everything will be perfect. But that moment never comes. Not because it doesn't exist, but because freedom doesn't come from the future. It comes from the present, from the way you walk. You don't become free in one day, you become free every day. When I understood this, I stopped comparing myself to others. I stopped blaming myself for not having achieved what I wanted yet. I began to feel the value in each small step. I enjoyed progress instead of waiting for perfection. And then I realized that financial freedom is not about money, it's about agency, about peace, about the feeling that you are holding the wheel of your own life. I've seen this in the eyes of ordinary people I've met. The man who sets aside a small part of his income to invest in the future. The woman who lives below her means and feels at ease. The young person who starts with $1 and feels himself growing through each habit. They may not be rich yet, but they are free because they are moving in the right direction. And like the morning sun, which doesn't appear in an explosion, but in a faint glow that slowly spreads, financial freedom comes in gradual opening. And then, one day you look back and realize you've come a very long way, not by one step, but by thousands of small steps no one saw. And then, after the journey of these 10 principles, I understood that what remains to be said is not another lesson, but an invitation. Keep walking. As we come to the end of the journey of these 10 principles, I want you to give yourself a quiet moment to look back at the path you've just walked. Not to judge whether you've done enough, but to recognize that the very act of listening, reflecting, and opening your heart is already a step forward. Because financial freedom does not come from haste, but from awareness. Not from leaps, but from steady steps. I once believed that life changes in a single moment, but then I realized that life changes in small choices repeated. $1 managed carefully, one portion given away, one seed sown, one environment chosen, one habit kept, one emotion overcome. And then, one by one, they connect into a larger journey. I want you to know this deeply and clearly. You are not alone in this journey, because anyone who has ever become free started from the place where you are standing now. They too were once confused, once worried, once doubtful, but they continued, and that is why they changed. If any part of this video touched you, keep it in your heart, because sometimes just one sentence, one idea, one moment can open a new door in your life. Thank you for spending this time here with me, with these reflections. It is an honor and a quiet joy. If you want to continue walking with me on this journey of growth gently, you can click like or subscribe. Not because I need it, but because I believe you are becoming someone who knows how to nourish what helps you grow. And before we part for now, I want to ask you a question, one you can answer in the comments below or keep just for yourself. Among these 10 principles, which one will you begin with today, no matter how small, how slow, even if it's just one step? And I want to close with the sentence I've carried throughout my life, the one that reminds me that freedom is not something we chase, but something we become. Success is not something you pursue. It is something you attract by the person you become. Jim Rohn. See you in the next video where we'll continue this journey one step at a time.